Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is Sunday morning at Gen Con 50. Some of us have, we are here for a while. I actually died of exhaustion the night before last, so I, as the moderator, am the ghost of John Peterson. But we're going to have a conversation today about role-playing on your feet, about, in some ways, the most visible manifestation of role-playing that you see around the halls of Gen Con, as you doubtless do. But we're going to do this with these four excellent panelists who I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. So please, start with you, Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew Biddle. I run World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade LARPs here for the last 4 years.
Okay. My name's Dave Radke. For those of you who are expecting Jeff Martin of True Dungeon, he apologizes. For the first time in over 30 years of coming to Gen Con, he's succumbed to the dreadly con crud, and so he asked me to step in for him. I've been volunteering with True Dungeon since its inception in 2003 and have pretty much been in every role in the event, from costumed NPC to on-site director.
I'm David Simkins. I'm a professor at RIT, and I study roleplay in general, digital LARP and tabletop. I've got a book on LARP called The Arts of LARP, and I've been involved in LARP since really 1996, but hybrids before that.
Hi, I'm Ann Brown. I was a games editor for TSR, and my last year there before the Great Migration to Seattle, they said, we need someone to run the costume contest. So I did it, and I've been doing it ever since. This is my 21st year running it. And I also ran costume contests at Gen Con SoCal when those were happening, and also for Lucasfilm at 4 of their celebrations.
So we've got some great people here to cover this. And I think we're going to start off today by talking about how LARPing was not always a thing at Gen Con, about how embodied play was not always a thing at Gen Con. And some of you may recall there was an incident in 1979 that both sparked a lot of interest in D&D, but also caused a lot of trepidation about what the consequences of playing D&D might be. Is there anyone who would like to speak to this here on the panel?
Sure. So we had a couple instances that happened, that came up in the news that were widely reported. We had a situation of a young man, a student, I think, who was really involved in D&D, decided to put on armor and go into the steam tunnels at his university, where the story goes he was, lost or killed himself or something like that. The story varies because there's really no fact behind any of that that anybody's actually found.
Still down there, right?
Yeah, right, exactly, right.
He turned up in Louisiana.
Yeah, right.
With Elvis, right?
Right, yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, this story really spread everywhere and started a real craze that was already brimming especially in the sort of Christian fundamentalist arena, where D&D was associated with witchcraft and demonology, and you had people looking into spells, the spell books, and trying to pull out, whether or not these were real spells. Now, I say they were looking into the spell books, but really they were looking into the idea of the spell books as represented by other people. So there were rumors that there were true incantations in the spells that were in Chivalry and Sorcery and D&D and all these early games. So that spread into this idea that taking it a step further was putting on a costume and going and trying to be that, and that would be the sign that you're not just engaging in this edge bad activity. You'd actually gone full crazy, right? There's also and on the other side there was a situation with the early tag or killer games where where one of the kids was supposedly running around with a dart gun and got spotted by the police and didn't surrender, or got the situation was misconstrued and they were shot. Again, there's no evidence of this from any credible source, but there were lots of news sources about it. In the very real news that was our news at the time.
I can say I've been pulled over by the police.
Yeah.
With a dart gun that looked like a Thompson machine gun, and the police were very interested in that back when we were playing tag. So, and even this sparked. So the rumors sparked Hollywood to get in on the scene. So we've had several attempts at trying to dramatize that exact event.
Right, Mazes and Monsters being a very Tom Hanks' Mazes and Monsters being a very known one.
Oh, know I remember.
Is it on Netflix? I don't know.
Yeah.
I hope
It
not.
would be worth a watch.
It is,
And
unfortunately.
I can also speak to this because I started playing D&D in probably 1982, and I got hired at TSR in 1989, and it was sort of the peak of the witch hunt craze. Is there really an altar in TSR's basement? No, there wasn't. 60 Minutes showed up at TSR before I worked there, and they were just tremendously disappointed that it was a game company.
Yeah.
And it was rooms full of computers and an art room and mapping people, and they went away just really, really disappointed. And to speak to the no LARPing at Gen Con, the reason for that is when I worked at TSR, we had like a 5-page code of ethics about all the things you can and can't put into your game product. And it was, evil can't be the hero, and how you can portray law enforcement, and nothing you can cook up in your own kitchen at home. Jim Ward used to say, I don't want the angry moms from heck calling me on the phone and saying, why is this in your game product? So, and a big part of the no LARPing is to not blur the lines between reality and fantasy. TSR was named in, I think, at least 13 lawsuits where they tried to name TSR as a mitigating factor in someone's death or harming of themselves or others. And I do remember Jim Ward and Steve Winter going off to testify at a couple of trials. In no case was TSR found liable for causing the death, because when you go through the game product, there really is nothing in there that says, well, here's how you cast a spell, here's how you trap a demon, here's how you summon Satan. There is just none of that. So that's the reason for no LARPing, because we didn't want to encourage people to do this live, something that they should be doing in a fantasy place in their head,
Right.
and therefore open ourselves up to something that could have caused a problem.
Yeah, I think your implication on all of those lawsuits, and certainly in the sort of historical lore of stories that are told of miniatures screaming as parents threw them away in the trash
Oh, yeah.
and things like that, I think it's a testament to how well the source materials were written and at least based and couched in pseudo-reality. So the information was there, and the information was embraceable and accessible by the people who were using it, but certainly there wasn't enough detail there to suggest anything, and certainly not to push people in a direction where they make a lifestyle change or a spiritual change based on this role-playing game.
Well, it
Although
was
some
funny,
of us
though.
might have seen it as such.
Yeah.
It was funny though that you mentioned chivalry and sorcery. Dave Simpkins. Sorry, we've got two Daves. I knew there was going to be a problem that we're going to have to do this the whole
Call me
time.
Jeff. That'll
Okay, I'll call you Jeff. I'll call you
You're
pseudo
David.
Jeff.
David, I'm David.
You mentioned chivalry and sorcery. I mean, there is a real difference actually between how people represented magic in these games. Chivalry and sorcery tried to be realistic, and that, of course, reminds me of Isaac Bonowitz. Do you remember this guy? He was at Berkeley. He was the guy who famously got his bachelor's degree in magic from the University
Yes.
of California,
yeah.
Berkeley. And he wrote this supplement. He was associated with people who were doing RuneQuest and things like that, called Authentic Thaumaturgy, which is trying to show you how to integrate real magic, right, into your role-playing game, at least based on his studies of magic and things like that at the time. I mean, I think there were people who pushed those boundaries hard, and it's where Isaac came from though was he and some of his friends. He was actually a druid in the SCA, right, and the SCA had a lot of in an attempt to get the Middle Ages that they should have been. To get people in those costumes, get people fighting that way. They ended up pushing those boundaries quite hard, even before D&D came out. Were any of you SCA people at all?
No,
You should have had an SCA.
Yeah.
never had the time.
Would you like to come forward? Your moment of greatness has come.
Please correct me if I'm wrong here. I do have a lot of crossover with SCA. I've got lots of friends that are SCA, but sadly never had the time to do it myself. Except a couple times in college, I went and did some heavy fighting with them, which doesn't really count. The SCA is, in my understanding from my friends, is an organization that really tries to recreate, as you said, the medieval ages as it should have been. It is definitely a society for creative anachronism. Right, it is not trying to be historically accurate, but it is trying to feel historical. And to that extent, it's I know later SCA better than early SCA. The first, I mean, I know the story of the first SCA, which was a birthday party, I think, where people got together and did jousting, fake jousting, and got in costume, got together for the birthday party, did fake jousting, had a big feast, and then went marching in a parade down the street, I believe. That's the story. But I wasn't there, and I don't know. Yeah? Okay, close enough. But after that, there's a big gap in my knowledge until at least the 70s, and really the 80s and 90s, when by that time, a lot of the SCA was kind of codified. It seemed kind of codified, at least in the kingdoms that I was aware of, where people came and were really encouraged to find pretty quickly a personality, a persona, an alternate persona to be to use in the SCA. So they had a name, they had a background, historical period, a specific historical period that they were kind of loosely basing it on, though they might be a little fuzzy because it is anachronistic. And then there was some emphasis on costuming, both accurately and if you were fighting safely. So that you would be able to kind of fit into the milieu of whatever you were doing. And in the wars, the groups of people that came together, they would really have a great time splitting up into their kind of regional personas, factions. And often there was a big kind of get together and party, and a good time was had by everyone. I have friends in the Mongols and other folks that were in the in the more European medieval factions. And they talk about this as very much a social experience that is highly valued, kind of coming together every year. A lot of SCA people insist that it is not a LARP. And I won't argue with them. They can call it not a LARP if they want. But I would say that a lot of the things that are done in the SCA are very LARP-like. And it's not that the whole thing is a LARP, because you fall out of character a lot, or at least you go into pseudo-character. But there are events that are rituals, that are like the fighting, but also getting badges, getting honors, and doing crafting that are very LARP-like. They're constructed in a way that has a tenor of its own and has a history of its own.
So it's sort of a freestyle LARP without a rule book.
Yeah, totally.
Kind of, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Rule light LARP. Well, some of it is actually rule heavy when it comes to
Oh,
badges.
is it? Okay. Okay.
only because there are certain things you have to do to get the badges.
Sure.
I mean, is that right? Good. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, not to imply a gender bias, but I see a lot of these groups as fraternal organizations, and that they are groups of like-minded people that are getting together to spend time together. As I'm not saying it's a form of escapism is almost putting a negative spin on it, but it definitely is I want to alter my reality for a time. I want to step out of what my day-to-day life is and enjoy something that immerses me in a situation where I'm a completely different, can be a completely different person, or at least have a completely different perception of the world around me.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess we're here today to untangle that from what people do in tabletop, right? When they do tabletop role-playing. And David suggested a great term that's kind of an umbrella for all these activities, some of which are kind of games, some of which maybe are not games so much. That would be embodied play. Yeah. And I think it might help to start off for each of you to kind of explain a bit of what it is the thing you do is like, and kind of why you're drawn to that thing, as distinct from the things that the other people here maybe are doing. So again, we'll go down the line this way. Drew, why don't you kind of kick off with where I cut my teeth role-playing vampire LARPing.
So I started playing Vampire LARP in 1994 with a huge group of college kids. The mid-90s was kind of the high point for VLARP, where it really started to take off. We easily hit 100, 120 people a game in a rented house in Fort Thomas, which the witch hunt for role players did not die down at all. The town that we actually played in applied to the state of Kentucky and was approved to set up their own satanic crimes division in the local police department. Their entire job was to investigate our vampire game, where we would get together on Saturday night for 6 hours, pretend to be vampires, play rock, paper, scissors, and then go home. Like we had our own playbook. They stole a copy to figure out what we were doing.
They didn't just ask.
They eventually did come to the house, and we showed them. If you've ever seen it, we call it the Big Green Monster Box, the very first edition of Vampire the Masquerade for LARP. And we're like, this is it. It's a role-playing game. It's like Dungeons and Dragons, except we stand up and put on costumes, and we all go to the Halloween store once a year and buy fake fangs. So.
And we have this box, by the way, in the museum at
Yes.
Lucas Oil Field. You can come see it. But yes, go on.
But yeah, so VLARP it's a parlor LARP, which means the games run anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. There are no buffers. You are not usually running around, but you will get up and move, and you're in costume, and we encourage people to stay in character for as much of the event as they possibly can. It's not rules light, but the rules are as simple as you can get them for a LARP, so any conflict between characters can be resolved quickly, and people can go back to role-playing, which is the main focus.
Very good.
So, and I think we didn't touch on it on the panel, but our pre-discussion to the panel, we touched on the fact that there's this separation or differentiation in the communities between a LARP and not a LARP. And so True Dungeon bills itself as not necessarily a LARP, although we are LARP friendly. We encourage people to play in character, but they don't necessarily have to.
Kind of explain for people who might not have done it, what True Dungeon is.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Well, so I'll start with my history. I mean, I got my start in the early 70s with role-playing games, sitting around the table with my friends. And Jeff Martin was kind of the same way. And one of our goals as a group was always to try to bring something more, an element of realism in what we were doing. Getting out of the house, getting away from the table, going and doing things. I remember setting up hunts, and not hunts in the sense of hunting something, but hunts in the sense of clues that got people to move from place to place to then achieve an objective in the end. And Jeff very much did the same thing. So he would run these huge campaigns, and at the very end of it, he would have this, for lack of a better term, boss room or a decorated room. In fact, he would rent out a hotel room and ask the hotel staff to remove all the furniture from the hotel room and fill it and decorate it as though it was the last room of his module. Take everybody out from their seats, go up to that room, and they would play out the last room of the module. From that came True Dungeon. True Dungeon is an interactive, immersive experience. When we describe it to people, we describe it as a haunted house without the scare. So you're in very much darkness. There is a lot of auditory stimulation, a lot of visual stimulation going on. And I do think we're trying to achieve that piece that always feels like it's missing. You know, you've got the social aspect when you're sitting around a table role-playing, but it's all here. It's all up in your head. And it's taking that and putting it in front of you. And also, we're trying to make it so that you can interact with your environment. So instead of a role-playing game where you roll a dice to say, what's my percentage of finding something, we look at the thief and go, I don't know, what do you find? And let them look around. You pick up things, you move things, you interact with things. So that's really the onus of True Dungeon. And then it was, how do we turn this into an experience for somebody that can run 2 hours, and they can be immersed in it and then walk away feeling as though they've had that piece, that time away from themselves for a while.
So, I mean, what are the components of play, I guess? Is it like an escape room when you were talking about finding things? Is it, do you fight things? Do you ever have to hit things?
Yeah,
or?
I would almost say that is, I'm not going to argue where people's ideas come from, because I think that everything kind of plays off of everything else. I would almost say that escape rooms kind of took some other ideas from us to an extent. Okay. But now we have started describing True Dungeon as kind of a 12-room escape room. So escaping the room, you move to the next room. And then you also have the stress component of a 12-minute time limit. So every room has its objective, and that objective might be to fight a monster, that objective might be to solve a puzzle, with the goal of achieving release from that particular room and moving on into the next room.
Fantastic.
All right. I started LARPing in the dirty days of Gen Con when LARP was not allowed, and I did so at Gen Con. The way that worked is there's a common story among people who have LARPed for a long time, which is that our group created LARP brand new in the early 80s, like everyone else. In fact, the LARP as we know it was really goes back to Treasure Trap and Dungeon Master, and some early Treasure Trap being the earliest that we know of, I think. Yeah, no, maybe.
Well, I mean,
there were some parlor LARPs before that, and
sure. I mean, do you consider Dagger Hero a LARP?
Okay. Right. I should clarify.
Yes.
I'm interested primarily in theater style LARP. which is if you separate LARP, you can separate LARP in a lot of ways. You can separate LARP from, hitty LARPs and talky LARPs, and these are talky LARPs. So more like White Wolf. In fact, a lot of White Wolf games are what I would call theater style games.
Yeah,
even within theater style is really a vast genre of LARP on its own,
It's like murder mystery games, right? Like
yeah.
Joy Swift, was that her name? And,
Yeah,
and hotel-based murder, right?
Right, and I would call those kind of edge cases of theater style, but of course other people wouldn't. So, and I'm not too worried about definitions, honestly. The theater style games I look at are generally 4 to 6 hour games, parlor games that are rules light and bespoke rules. So they're really tailor made to that game. So they have very streamlined rule systems, often emulating something else. So there are games that are trying to be like Deadlands, but they don't use the whole Deadlands rules. In fact, they use none of the Deadlands rules. They use rules that are reminiscent of what you'd find in Deadlands, but allow you to do exactly what needs to be done in the LARP very quickly. So they use poker chips for power and things like that. And the reason is they don't want to be weighted down by the system when the whole point is to be embodied, right? To be playing out this moment. So I started playing in a Gen Con game called Justice Incorporated, which was what they called at the time a single camera game. They didn't call it a LARP because really they didn't know what LARP was. That word had not come into their vocabulary yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I haven't seen in Australia we had a
Yes.
thing called Freeform,
Sure.
which were sort of a lot like that, but not necessarily in costume.
Right.
Like about 20 to, usually about 20 to 30 players, very rules light.
Right.
At CanCon, at Fantasticon,
Yep.
famous Canberra
Yep.
LARPs of 82 and 83,
Yeah, and we should just clarify this word freeform is used in Australia and England for a lot of things, but including LARP. In the Nordic countries, it's used for kind of versions of tabletop games. So it's kind of confusing as a term, but as far as I know, the UK and Australians used it first, so I'll give them that credit. The single camera game was a tabletop game in structure. You had 8 people at a table at first, and then they got the table out of the way and put the chairs on the side of this little booth that they were running in, right? The Gen Con curtained off areas at the time. And they would do one scene at a time, and the only things that mattered were the things that were happening on scene, on camera. So, a couple players at a time would get together and have a scene, and then you'd go out of character and talk about what the next scene was, and then you'd have another scene. And it was all embodied, so it was what I would call LARP or LARP-like, hybrid. But it seemed to skirt the Gen Con rules because they didn't bust us. So,
Or they didn't know.
or they didn't know, which is more likely. But there was no live combat, and there was no kind of dangerous stuff, and there was really no costuming. I mean, the costuming didn't happen until later. People would just show up in their Gen Con wear. So that migrated into LARPs, and I started doing White Wolf LARP in 1986. And then started moving into these bespoke LARPs. Intercon is a convention that happens a very small convention that happens in the Boston area. It has about 400 people, 300 people that come every year, and it is entirely these small parlor LARPs, and they have a lot of genre differences, but they do tend to, be much costume rich, settings rich compared to here. It's the kind of game where you sign up to play and you show up, or else there's a lot of social norming against you because you're drilling a hole in the game, right? And that game requires it. It's highly character-driven, highly intertwined characters. So that style of LARP is sort of contrasted with a lot of dungeon LARPs that aren't character-driven. It doesn't matter which. You have a personality, but you're fitting it into whatever's happening, rather than the characters being written for the interaction that's happening in your game. So the characters are written by the game masters, right? They're written for you, almost always, right? Actually, always at Intercon, and almost always in these games. So that's a little bit different genre than some people are used to, especially in campaigns, where people will write their own games and then bring that in. And in some games, those then get intertwined over time into the story that's going on, and it becomes character driven. But it doesn't necessarily start that way. Right? Make sense?
Yeah, so the thing about the costume contest that really interests me the most, I think, and actually I should back up a little bit. So after doing the costume contest for so many years, I think you can divide costumers into a couple different categories. There are the ones that, wake up one morning and say, I want a Thor costume. I'm going to make a Thor costume, and they run to the fabric store and they make a cape and do a few things, and they've got a Thor. And then there's another guy that's like, I want a Thor costume, and they research vacuum forming and Warbla and foam and all this kind of stuff, and they actually create a really nice piece of armor, and they get the good fabric, and they put the pleats in, and they figure out the helmet. And then there are those that just want to really go over the top and get every last detail down, and they study the material, and they look for all the little nuances and details, and they incorporate that into the costume. Having done the Star Wars costume contests, the people that participate in those are the most detail-oriented costumers I have ever seen. If any of you know what Pantone colors are, in printing you have this book of these colors, and a Pantone book is true to the exact color that you will get in your printed product. And they're about this thick, and there's about 5 colors on a sheet in Think Paint chips. And we were in the museum once at a Star Wars convention, and I saw one of my contestants in there with a Pantone book, holding it up to the costume she was interested in and trying to get the exact shade match. They study footage, they look for stills. A friend of mine did Bail Organa. Am I saying that right? Right? Yeah?
Close enough.
And at some scene, he turns around and they discovered that there's a tassel on the back of his cloak, and they were all excited, and they had to go out and get that tassel and figure out how to make that. Jedi costumers talk a lot about food capsules, which are those little things Jedi wear on their little belt, if you've ever noticed those. And to make them authentic, you use Sharpie marker caps. That is how they did it in the movie, and that's what the costumers do. So there's all these different philosophies. Then there are the folks that are, they think of a costume and they think, man, can I do that? And they engineer, and they buy 3,000 pheasant feathers, or they learn how to do acrylics or airbrushing makeup. So it's really interesting, the range of personalities and psychology that come to costuming, because some are about the details, the construction, and some really want to become a certain character. And the other facet of this that I find really interesting is back in the Milwaukee days of Gen Con, the Klingons used to do a jail and bail.
Yeah.
And the Klingons were really active at that time because there were Star Trek movies that were coming out, and the Klingons helped us out with line control and all kinds of things. There were Klingons everywhere. What was really fascinating is the way the crowd reacted to Klingons, because when a Klingon is standing at the end of the line going, people just did what the Klingon said. Nobody hesitated, because heck, that's a Klingon. And so there was this really cool, the blur of fantasy reality, because in our heads, we all know what Klingons mean, and we somehow interpret that as a real Klingon. And people react to costumes in really interesting ways, too, similar ways that when they see certain costumes, they react to the character or the movie material as opposed to the individual wearing that outfit. So there's a lot of really interesting psychology going on. People ask me why I still do the costume contest, and one thing, it's a blast. We get so many different kinds of interesting people with so many different ideas. You never know what you're going to get next. This is the first year we had a balloon costume that was made entirely out of balloons. Last year we had a dog for the first time. If you remember, I'm not going to get the character right, so I'll move on from that. Yeah. But I often wonder where people get their ideas, what drives them. It's their hobby, as we have other hobbies like people golf or knit or whatever, and it's so interesting to see their psychology and the psychology of the people who view them and how they interact. Yeah, and I think there's probably psychological material to be written, or papers or something about.
Well, I mean, this is a phenomenon that goes back. I mean, I think it's important to talk about. I don't know how much you were involved in SF fandom and with like masquerades and things like that they would have at Worldcon.
Yeah, not really. And in fact, I probably shouldn't say this, but I've done very little costuming myself, and I've made costumes for my kids frequently, but I'm just not really a costumer. I don't have the time, for one thing. But yeah, running the costume contest, I have a different perspective. I'm more of an observer of the.
Well, I mean,
the microcosm.
Right. Academics like David here, I'm sure we'll talk about how fan participation in these media properties is something that's very widely studied, and the degree to which fans
want to
Yeah.
integrate themselves right into these stories that they love so much.
Right.
One thing that fascinates me looking at the costumes as I go by, many I recognize. Some I can recognize as the mashups. Mashups are very
Oh, yeah.
popular these days, right? Where you take two things and kind of blend them together. And sometimes when I look at people, I'm like, maybe I just don't recognize this, or maybe this is like their character, something they made.
Yeah.
So to what degree do you think people who are costuming just around Gen Con that we see here, what percentage are, I'm faithfully doing one thing, versus this is a joke, a mashup, or some way that I'm commenting on this, or versus just I think this would look really cool and I made this and it's me.
Wow. I think the ones that do, this is my character, I think that's a really small percentage, because I think they also realize that people aren't going to recognize who they are. I think customers get a big kick out of it when people recognize what they are. Like, hey, you're so-and-so from whatchamacallit, and they love that. I think the majority are trying to be true to the character they're portraying. But then you do get those, like we had steampunk Disney princesses.
Right.
And there were 3 or 4 of them, and it was really cute. And they looked like the Disney princess, but they had all the steampunk gear added on, and it was really neat. So it's always interesting to see those mashups, the way people put their own spin on it. And then there are these things that are just like, somebody had a brilliant idea. Yesterday we had a guy, we just loved this guy. He was in a chainmail suit. And when I say suit, I mean a men's suit. And it was a black suit coat, and it was black pants, and he had a silver tie, and the knot was a little different chain from the rest of the tie. It weighed 25 pounds. He spent a long time putting this thing together, and it looked awesome. And I think he could have worn it to a business meeting and not been made fun of seriously. So people just think of something really original. But I think the vast majority are people that are trying to be true to a character.
Yep.
And trying to execute it in the best possible way they can.
I mean, that's fascinating to me, and in my moderator looking for structure out of this interesting umbrella of things that are embodied play that we're talking about here. One of the distinctions I heard between Drew and David especially was, in the Camarilla, LARP say, you come and make up your own character,
Yes.
right? You come to this story, whereas it's much more common in the SIL sort of tradition of theater LARPs for the character to be very specific, and you're there kind of parachuted in. You may not even know until you get there. But you're given a briefing sheet. Explain a little bit, maybe, David, about like the briefing sheet you might be given,
Sure.
like the blue sheets, right, or whatever.
Yeah. So you can have there's a lot of variety, but generally characters in this kind of game are 3 to 5 pages of character, maybe 2 to 3 pages of rules, unless they've really gone overboard. And the rules are usually pretty streamlined, so you have 2 to 3 pages of rules, and it tells you more how to interact with them than like numbers or anything like that. Numbers are usually removed, or are largely removed. So 3 to 5 pages of background for yourself generally is focused on kind of who you are, building who you are, and then either obviously or less obviously integrating you with a lot of other characters, right? And building this network, this web of characters that have
Give some
previous
examples
history.
of that from a game. Like,
So if you were going to build a LARP for the newest Star Wars movie, you'd want to make say that this newest Star Wars movie was a LARP, right? The actual Star Wars trilogy. You'd want Han and Leia and whatever, and people might know those characters, but then you'd have other characters that are tied to them, some secretly and some obviously, and you'd want the players to know that that these characters have ties. I'm forgetting everyone's name. The young woman that is the main character
Ray.
of the show. Somebody can help me out here. Ray, thank you. Yes, I've seen these movies.
It's Sunday morning, don't
Yeah,
worry.
please. Ray in that show, right? There are a lot of fan theories about who Ray is, right? Ray maybe in her character sheet says, you don't know it, but you are secretly Luke's daughter, or you are secretly, Anakin's
Third cousin.
or a clone that's been gender switched, whatever, right? So all these things are built into your character, some of which you may know, some of which your character may know, and some of which you may know so that you can play off of it with other characters and kind of play off the idea and maybe reach the point where they guess who you are. You have a little bit of dramatic irony going on there. Where a player and character know separate information. Some other games remove all that dramatic irony and just let you know what you know, but it's a good idea to bury all information that you want to come out in game several places in game, so build relationships that are going to, if one relationship doesn't bring out the point you want, there's another relationship that'll bring the same point out. Han Solo and Leia both have a son. If the Han Solo player kind of fumbles the connection with the son, Leia can pick it up and remind Han Solo, and they could play out the rest of the game without missing that important, vital relationship. Because people do read these characters sometimes last minute, and sometimes they don't get cast until they walk in the door, and then they have to pick up these characters, read 5 pages of material, remember all these different names and relationships, and then go on stage and play them out. There are games that are meant to be cast at the door. There are games that are often cast at the door, though they didn't mean to be. And then there are games where there are games that are really pretty overboard and have 20 pages of character material, 20 pages of blue sheets, which are common information for a particular group. So a blue sheet might be, what is the Empire really like, right? The Empire blue sheet. And all Empire players get that blue sheet, but not any of the other characters. What is the Resistance really like? The Rebellion. These blue sheets might add up to another 20 pages. So you have 45, 50 pages of rules. There are some traditions that are pretty critical of this tradition for requiring you to have a higher degree in LARP in order to comprehend what all of this is and bring it on stage. There's some people that are really trying to move to a much lighter reading load and analysis load before you walk into game. But that is a mainstay of this.
Let's bring this back to Drew.
Yep.
Yeah. And because my recollection and I drove all around New England with my friends in the mid-90s, just parachuting myself into various vampire LARPs. I walk in, I meet the storyteller, I negotiate a character. I mean, what is your,
So that's one of the things that we do with our games here at Gen Con. We had 90 players last night. 45 of them had never LARPed before.
Wow.
So they hit the door, we handed them pre-generated character sheets, and helped them bang out a short personality, what's your name, where you're from, when did your character become a vampire, and then my staff and I always make sure we introduce them to a few of our established players, give them some ties that are tenuous that they can work on, and it gives them an opportunity to role play during the game, and then they can take their sheet and go play.
But some more experienced players must come in and say, I'm here to play Tremere, I always play Tremere, and I have my...
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we do have people who have played World of Darkness games before who show up with a very specific, I want to play this thing, can I do that? And if it fits within the Chronicle, absolutely, we'll help them bang a sheet out and get them right into the game.
But the Euthanatos Abomination that I want to play is probably, yes.
Probably not, no. Right. Yeah.
I mean, to tie some of this in, we were talking about accessibility. And one of the things that we were talking about before the panel started was that True Dungeon may be a way for people who are interested in doing that active role playing, but maybe a little bit worried about stepping over into the world of LARPing because there's this stress level of I'm now going to be expected to play in character and I have to follow the rules and I have to engage in a certain way. But we have pre-generated characters. We have a one sheet that the players are given that has information on it. And very early on in the first few years, Jeff would embed information about their characters. And so the expectation was that they were all human characters except for the rogue, who was always a halfling. Okay. And that was important because no matter if the person playing them was 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall, the halfling could access certain areas of the dungeon that the rest of the group couldn't. And if they remembered that and knew that, then they had certain avenues open to them. We also gave them names. We gave them birth dates. And some of the puzzles were based on their names and their birth dates and things like that. So if they bothered to remember it, they were golden and they could get through that room. We have strayed away from that a little bit just because we got some feedback that, okay, that's way too much. I can't remember, it's difficult for me to remember in the 12-minute session that I have to look at this sheet that my name was Welfer and that I'm a halfling and that my birthday was August. So we really do abstract away from that. And we've got different variations of people who play this. We have people who come back and play every year and they are the rogue. That's what they do. And they will come in and they will play it to the hilt. They will costume, they will dress, they will get in character, and they're great. And then we will have people who will walk in and bring their spouse, and their spouse has never played any kind of role-playing game ever. And they walk in, and most of the time, I'll tell you, they will do better than their significant others because they don't game the system. They don't try so hard to figure out how to play. They just enjoy the experience.
Now, in True Dungeon, do you have continuous characters if you come back year after? Could you have, like, you get experience points for True Dungeon?
Yeah,
I see these tokens.
Yeah,
right,
there's sort of
that
an in-game, out-game schism
Yes,
that
yes.
we have. So the players that come back every year, they earn real-world
Yes.
experience points. So they have some benefits that they can take advantage of year after year after year. But the actual in-game character that they're playing is really just the archetype. And we establish the archetype. You choose the fighter. You are the fighter type. Presumably, you will choose to do fighter-type things. But there's nothing stopping the fighter, who happens to also be an MIT professor, going in and doing nothing but puzzle solving the entire time.
And you kind of have different tracks, right? You can have the more puzzle solving, or at some
Yes.
point you did, right? You could do a
Yeah.
more puzzle solving track versus a more kind of physically active.
Right. So we had different groups of people. Ones that really, really liked the combat system, and that's all they really cared about. And the creator of True Dungeon has a certain mindset, and some people just don't get it. And so for them, the puzzles are a little bit more difficult. And so they said, oh, hey, I want to focus on combat. Or they really do love the puzzle solving, and they really don't like the combat as much. So we tried to give them a variety. And then we had one special game that we've created that's nothing but combat. So you go in, and from the minute you walk in the door, you are faced with monster after monster after monster after monster until everybody's dead.
So, and I mean, one of the things that's fascinating talking about an activity, again, we're kind of grouping some things that, as we can see here, they're different, right, under this one umbrella. I mean, I'm just kind of curious how much cross-pollination across this the panelists think there really was. Like, how much were you really aware of True Dungeon, say, Drew? Or, you know, how much of the costuming tradition, right, factors into the vampire play and things like that. So, I mean, I kind of want to understand what in people's DNA draws them to these different traditions that have, again, some overlap, right? The Venn diagram, we can see the places that they overlap.
Right.
And they all can wiggle a little too, right? They're all things you'll see that kind of get you closer to one of the other poles. So maybe we can go through and just kind of talk about what draws each of you to the thing you do and how much you have had, how much you've encountered the other aspects of this in your experiences as gamers and costumers.
I think there's a lot of churn between all of the groups, honestly. Some of my favorite players at my World of Darkness games are cosplayers because they crank their costumes up to 11. And I don't want to say that it sets a bar for everybody else, but it encourages people to step outside their comfort zone and try to make a better costume or come up with a better costume. And there are so many easy ways to do that in a VLARP. You know, you can go to a thrift store, or you can order something off of Amazon. It's not a game that requires you to spend 60 hours sewing something, you know, which is nice. I've got players in my games regularly that do True Dungeon, that do the more theater-style LARPs. I've got players that go to boffer LARPs, like Amtgard, Dystopia
Nero.
Rising, Nero, all that kind of stuff. So. And really, it's just, you know, some people will come and try it, and they will decide that parlor LARP is not actiony enough for them. And they want to go out in the woods and be camping for 3 days and beating on their friends with foam sticks. And they go and they do that instead. But, yeah, we see a fair amount of cross-pollination between all of it, I think.
Yeah, I definitely see the crossover, and I think it's good, actually. We're blurring the lines between what used to be different camps. Oh, I'm not that. I will do this, but I won't do that. You know, I can't play in character, but I love role-playing. We have, and it's interesting because there are some really unique friendships that have formed. It's 15 years now, so it's kind of strange to say that, but we have people who met playing the game for the very first time in 2003 who still get together. And those are the groups that have kind of fostered that, taking it to the next level with each other. And so they will come in character and play together as a group and go through the event. And then they'll just join another group randomly just for the experience of meeting other people. So I think everybody's got different motivations for doing this because it's allowing them to scratch whatever itch that is, whether it's a creative itch or it's an escapism itch or whatever. And I'm glad to see that it's no longer you do this, I do this, we're very, very different, and I don't even want to be in the same room with you, and I can't even discuss how your style of play and my style of play are more the same than they are different.
I'm fascinated by the, like a lot of people, we started LARPing because we were tabletopping and we stood up.
Yeah.
Right. It's not. We didn't. There was nothing more complicated than that. There was some scene that we really just needed to play out, so we stood up and played it out. The crossover with World of Darkness has been massive. World of Darkness is so much bigger than the parlor LARP scene, and brought so many women into general LARPing that the parlor LARP scene had a pretty good ratio already, but just having more people interested in this kind of thing and then looking for something that was similar but a little different led to a big surge of new energy into parlor LARPs. So we owe a lot to the World of Darkness folks for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we just had Mark Grunhagen was just sitting here next to me 2 nights ago on our Embrace the Night panel, and Mark talked about how transformative it was for Gen Con Vampire alone was.
Oh, yeah.
Of just how much female participation was triggered by tabletop Vampire, and of course LARP Vampire then became a big part of that.
Yeah.
And I want to get to Anne, although you've already told us a bit about why you love the costuming part, but we'll get
A bit,
get to this
yeah.
in a sec. But if I just as one interrupt on the way to that, it's important that people get, I think, the degree to which that theater LARP stuff actually informed the Vampire,
Right.
in the sense, Ian Lemke, Night Owl Games, did you know those guys?
Yeah.
Because they were part of the ILF, right?
Yep. So I didn't know that, but I know
Yeah.
Limke a little later, and we talked a lot about his involvement and his inspirations earlier on from the theater style LARP.
Because I mean, I think they ran the first Vampire. The Night Owl guy ran the first Vampire LARPs at it wasn't. I don't know if it was Intercom, but it was one of the subordinate events of that.
Yeah.
So anyway, just interesting historical side note.
And then they were doing a kind of parallel thing with Masqueraded down in Atlanta for a long time and building up so that ended up really informing World of Darkness,
Yeah.
that then bought it and kind of
Yeah.
backfilled, and it was a wonderful interplay of things. When it comes to cosplay, I feel like the overlap is really clear, but it's a little bit skewed. A lot of it is more like the SCA, really a real interest in historical accuracy. If you're going to play for some of the population, not all, but some. If you're going to play a Victorian game, getting Victorian absolutely right. If you're going to play an Elizabethan game, getting Elizabethan absolutely right. So you're building your character, which is not an iconic character, but you're getting the materials right. You're getting the look right. And of course, not everyone is interested in that, and not everyone does it. And there's no ethic that says that everyone has to. But some people just love that part of it, and they bring it into their parlor LARP.
I would agree with that. In fact, to talk to the cross-pollination that I think the Venn diagram of all these different groups is kind of like a Jackson Pollock painting these days. There is no Venn diagram.
Right.
Everybody's unique, and I think everybody brings their own thing. My first Gen Cons were 1983 and 84 at UW Parkside, and I remember there was one guy who walked around in a cleric kind of robe thing. He was one of the very few costumers, but he wore it a couple years in a row, so clearly he was comfortable, wearing a costume in an area, in a place where there weren't a lot of costumes. And then gradually you started seeing more and more, and then you see these surges when there's a Star Wars movie out, or there were Star Trek movies out, or steampunk had a huge surge for a while. I often wonder why certain things appeal to certain people. And I do see a lot of people who they created their costume because of a game, or because of a character, or because of a LARP, or a genre they're interested in. And sometimes it's the reverse, not as often, where they've always been interested in, like you said, Victorian or something, and so that is their kind of entry gateway into this other place. So everybody. I think everybody's just unique. It's really interesting to see what people, where they find their time, or where they choose to put their energy in researching undergarments of the 1920s, or whale boning
kidding.
in a corset, or
Right.
all these. There's so much detail, and there's a lot of research to be done. And of course, the internet makes it so much easier these days. So I think it's just made a richer world for all of us. I also think it's kind of made a more accepting world. I saw a guy in the exhibit hall yesterday, bald guy, and he's wearing this little crocheted, funny little cap that looks kind of like a creature, and those elastic under the chin, and he's just strolling around in his shorts and t-shirt, but he was fine wearing this cute little hat thing. It meant something to him, And you see a lot of that these days, where someone's wearing a pin or something, a necklace, or just one accessory that is kind of expressing something. People with little Cthulhu's on their shoulders or what have you. So I think it's such a neat blend of people, and it's a really rich environment of different people with different tastes.
Would you agree, I guess, with Mark Reinhagen, and I guess more broadly to the point that embodied play is something that has been beneficial to female participation overall? And this is a kind of fraught question. Let me say why it's fraught first, because I think back in the origins of the FCA, I think the roles were kind of gendered in a way that they are not now, but they were then. Where kind of women did costumes, guys did fighting. So I recognizing that it is fraught with that, do you generally think embodied play has been helpful to getting more women engaged in things like Gen Con? Or?
The gender question is really interesting, and it's something I've been aware of for a long time. Back in the TSR days, we actually spent some time trying to develop a role-playing game for girls. And we had meetings about this, and we went out and bought books and games that were for girls, and it was games like Dream Phone and Mall Madness and that. And we started talking about how do girls play differently from boys. And at the earliest level, when I remember being 5 and 6 and 7 years old and you're playing house, you were role playing. You really were role playing. And we felt that little girls were actually more attuned to role playing than little boys. Because if you had a pile of army men, what do boys do? They line them up and they throw rocks at them. And what do girls do? This is Billy, this is Sammy, this is Tony, and he's Sammy's brother. And this is there would be a story about those army men, and they would probably go off and do something really interesting as opposed to throwing rocks at them.
I think the Bronte sisters did that, right? With the little worlds that they invented for themselves. It all started from toy soldiers that they had. And that they built these elaborate paracosm worlds of this, yeah.
Yeah, so number one, I think women are natural born role players. I think somehow so when women started finding role-playing games, and when some of the stigma went away, because I think there was a stigma, they're D&D people, I remember being at a conference one time and standing in line and talking to people. Oh, so where do you work? Oh, I work for Dungeons. And honest to gosh, this woman backed up a little bit. And I'm like, okay, well, she still thinks those things in the 80s that we talked about earlier. So I think the options for women and the acceptance of all these different things at conventions and in gameplay and LARP and role-playing, everything, I think it's just opened up a lot for a lot of people. And the other thing that I find interesting is what makes women and men who are librarians and special ed teachers and engineers by day put on a barbarian costume or a really tight corset and she feels like a, whatever you want to imagine, some Renaissance maiden or something. So where does your daily life, what is that transition that now you feel free to play a character, and the transformation when you're in a costume of feeling very different? And I think when we sit down at tables and when we LARP too, you are the wizard and you're thinking differently, or you're the thief and you are thinking differently. So there's so much psychology behind this.
I was going to ask, do you still see very distinct motivations for getting into costuming, or is that itself even kind of blurring? Because I can see the people who would do costuming because they want to achieve a look or a costume or embody a character. And I can also see people who do costuming because it helps them, get into a character or play a game. So I feel like there are different motivations, but I also feel like that might be changing somewhat.
There's so many different motivations, I think. Even, when you go to the Renaissance Fair and it's just your average family basically, and they've dressed up in Renaissance garb, well, they really clearly felt comfortable doing that and thought, hey, let's get costumes, just to run around. And of course, we've all done Halloween costumes. Mm-hmm. I bet there's not, everyone in the room's worn a costume at least once, right? When you're little, trick-or-treating or something.
Maybe you could speak a bit. Do you think costumes are liberating to people?
Oh, I really do.
That it
I
reduces
totally
your
do.
inhibitions.
Totally,
to be
yeah.
in costume.
And when you listen to actors and actresses talk about a movie role, you often hear them say, "Well, once I get into costume and makeup, it's so much easier, and I'm there. I'm that person. I'm that character. That helps with the transformation of getting inside that character's head." So, the costume is definitely a.
You can do things in costume that you might not be able to bring yourself to do if you weren't in costume.
Yep.
One of the things that's I think crossed over and back from theater and from cosplay is mask play. And this idea that when you put on a mask, you can be somebody else, and you have, this alibi to
Yeah, and no one knows who you
act
are.
differently, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most interesting transformations I've ever seen in the games that I've run over the last 20 years is the exceptionally shy gamer, like literally that stereotype, who goes out, creates his character, decides he's going to go buy the power suit, puts it on, shows up at the game in that suit, and runs train on everybody there politically, and has everybody dancing to his tune. And then the game's over, he goes and changes. We go to afters to have dinner, and just kind of the denouement from the game, and talk about this happened and that happened and this is going on and whatever. And then he's back to just being that shy kid that just sit there and have dinner, and he'll talk, but he's not here anymore. He's back down here, and it's a really interesting transformation when somebody puts on a costume.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why people play LARPs like Vampire LARPs?
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the reasons I started playing. When I was younger, I was, for a lot of different reasons, incredibly angry all the time, and I created a character for my very first Vampire LARP that I could be angry all the time, and it was normal for him, and it helped me get it out of my system.
Bruja, or?
No, it was Nosferatu.
Oh, very nice.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
As a game for learning guy, I like games for learning. One of the things I love about this hobby is that for some people it really is sort of self-therapeutic, right? It really helps them to right. It can be. It can be a way to for a shy person to figure out how to practice being confident. For a person who's a little bit socially awkward to practice connecting with other people. All sorts of, for somebody who's loud to practice listening and quieting down. I mean, there are all these skills that are useful in the game, so there's a kind of a motivation, but also socially encouraged that you can practice in a place with mitigated consequences. Right, there are some consequences in game, but they're not consequences in real life. These folks, it's a very accepting community generally. The folks aren't going to hate you for it, and you're going to try and practice and fail and get better at it over time.
Yeah, and I mean, if you sit down and you write a character for a game and it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. You can always scrap it and start again,
Right.
I mean, but David, to the point you're just speaking to, do you think the people who go to a theater LARP, so certainly some of this is therapeutic, but I've always found those to be more artistic products that people are collaborating and generating. When I think to myself, what I think the motivation is for people doing those kinds of games, for both designing them and participating in them, I see artistic goals. In fact, it's difficult for me to distinguish those from artistic goals. Is that the way you see it, or do you see it differently?
I actually don't think the therapeutic aspect is a goal for most people.
That's right.
I think it's a byproduct.
Very
And now there are Nordic LARPs that are really pushing that boundary.
Of course.
But not in the genre I'm primarily talking about, the theater style LARP. I think the therapy, if it exists at all, which I wouldn't say it always does, is byproduct primarily.
Yeah.
And then after the fact, they're like, oh, yeah, I was a leader in these games for 10 years, and I now am a manager, and I don't think I ever could have done it without that. Now, there's no knowing, right? There's no knowing whether or not they would have developed those skills some other way. But the fact is, some people say that they did. Other people say, I've done some interviews on this, and other people say, no, I took those leadership positions in the game because I was good at that. And I'm a manager because I'm good at that. And I didn't build skills there, I used skills there. I used it for the theater purpose, right? The artistic purpose. Art is a word that we argue about all the time.
I know,
It's
yeah,
a roleplay art. And I'm,
They're
like a lot of
aesthetic,
other things,
right.
I'm agnostic about
They're
that.
aesthetic goals. You're aiming for an aesthetic goal to make
I'll say they're
work of-
artistic goals.
right,
You
right.
said it, I'll go with it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, but take us a little bit down that path, though, you just mentioned, just so people are aware that this exists. There isn't a lot of like cheap form things that happen here, right?
Yeah.
They do occasionally, I guess. People do.
There are some folks that are who are bringing Nordic LARP, and I credit them for it. I mean, Nordic LARP is a geographic name that is increasingly talking about historical roots more than where it exists.
Right.
Although there are traditions that are pretty constant and a lot of variation within them. Nordic LARP is really experimenting with the edges, sort of how it's defined. It's really experimenting with the edges of what LARP can be. Everything from a game called White Death, which has no spoken word at all. All the players are silent. Everything is done with action, with mime. It starts with workshopping, which is very common in Nordic LARP. You workshop how to do this thing in this environment. how to walk like earth, how to walk like fire, how to walk like air. And you don't even know what that means at first. But then in game, it's clear that from simple mechanisms, there's a spotlight on one end. You have to stay within the spotlight most of the time. And you are earth and fire, right? And then at some point, you may, I don't know, die maybe. It's not explained, but something like die. And you exit the spotlight and you can't enter, but you can entice people out of the spotlight. And you walk like air and water. So you have these light, flowing creatures on the outside of the darkness, enticing people in the light out. And the people in the light are rigid and have a hard time moving around and are clustered and are hungry. And there's this interesting kind of a very much artistic dynamic that's going on that's played out with simple rules, none of which involve rock, paper, scissors or anything else. It's all rules of movement, like where you can move. It's made by a dancer. She's brilliant. She's and it is a brilliant game. I haven't done it justice by talking about it, but the game itself works extremely well in creating movements that then translate to meaning in the game that you act out and make real just by following it. And even though she doesn't stick to any particular themes, she doesn't commit to any themes, it's pretty clear that there are themes there that the players see. That's one of the things I think is interesting about this. Unlike a movie where we can argue about what that movie meant, every person's perspective in this is completely their own and shared with everyone else there at the same time. But you can't argue about what somebody else's
Right,
perspective
what the
was.
authorial intention was,
Right.
right? It's impossible, yes.
Right, it's kind of I think it's kind of a mistake, right?
Right.
The GMs have a intent, but they're only one of the authors. All the players are also authors.
Right. And I'm fascinated by things like that because it just shows how vibrant this still is today. The innovations people are pushing forward and all of this. So, how long has the Camarilla been around?
So I joined in 96, I think 92? 92 sounds right. I was originally going to join in 94, but that's the year they had to change the age from 16 to 18 to sign up.
Right.
So I had to wait another 2 years. But yeah, I've been a member since 1996. We've done games all over the country, all over the world. So.
And are still today. And
Yeah,
so this
still today.
this one you had here at Gen Con, what you
Yep.
said was the largest one yet you had here at Gen
Yep.
Con?
Right.
Yep.
That's
This
great.
is my 4th year running the event, and this was the biggest game we've had here yet. And we get so many new people who are like, I want to try this. Help.
Yeah.
And those are my favorite games. When somebody new shows up and says, I've never done this. I would really like to try it out. Please help me. My favorite.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And how big is True Dungeon now? I mean, so Alex Cameron and I are good friends. I don't really know Jeff that well, so I'm sure if I wanted to get a ticket, I could pick his pocket. But like, you can get tickets for True Dungeon, right?
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
it sells out pretty fast, which is amazing.
yeah.
And
How
I
many
think,
people do it every year? Do you know what the figure is?
We're in the thousands now. I think we're around 3,000 tickets for the event for the 3 days. When it was first set up, it was probably in a room twice this size. It was one dungeon. Now, and he was shocked, when he walked in and saw the empty room. I think he was in a panic of how am I going to make this happen. But now that old surface area fits half of what we do just to teach the game.
Wow.
We take up 45,000 square feet there's a huge convention area underneath Lucas Oil Stadium. It takes us 3 days to assemble, 6 hours to tear down, and we run it for 3 days. We have over 230 volunteers. It's an amazing experience, an amazing event. I actually tripped across it by accident. So when Gen Con moved to Indiana, I had always looked at Gen Con, never managed to go. It was either an age thing or a money thing or whatever. And it was here, I was like, I have to go. So completely on a lark, I called up Wes at the time. Is he still doing the volunteer program?
Wes
here?
Carpenter? Yeah, he's still here.
And said, hey, I'm local. I can get off midweek. Is there an opportunity for me to volunteer? And he said, yeah, I got this weird new game coming in called True Dungeon. I'll hook you up with them because they need some help and they might have you do some stuff. And so I went into it completely blind and was hooked and have been doing it ever since. So 15 years later, and over 30 events, and I've been involved in every one of them in some way, shape, or form. So, but you were talking about before about the motivations of why somebody does this, and for me, it's I don't play very much, but I love the production aspect. I love putting on the event. I love designing the event. I love building the event. It's very much that theater background. And Jeff likes to joke that we have, over 200 people who bust their rear for a week or more just to allow other people to have a good experience. So it's kind of a special thing all of its own, but we would love for other things to happen. So a couple of years ago, there was sort of a takeoff, a riff on sort of a Space Warriors sort of aliens type event that was a role-playing game. Everybody was worried that Jeff was going to be offended. He's like, no, I'd love to play it. Because he can't play True Dungeon. He develops it every year, so it kind of ruins that for him.
And now that Alex is involved, I guess, in True Dungeon, is True Dungeon coming to Gamehole, or did it already?
So we were at Gamehole Con last year.
Yes. I was there, and I was super busy, and I didn't see anything, so yes.
Yeah, I think it's expanding. So for a while, Peter, when he brought True Dungeon to Gen Con, wanted it to be an exclusive Gen Con thing. Mm-hmm. It was going to be his anchor, his hook to get people to come here. And after a certain number of years, they kind of sat back down and said, hey, what I'd really like to do is premiere everything that we do with True Dungeon at Gen Con, but then take it on the road to some other conventions. And so right now we're seriously looking at continuing Gamehole Con. We did one at Origins, which I think went over very well, so there's a good possibility we might be doing Origins, but it will always be some flavor of what we introduce at Gen Con that year.
And so are you going to be at Gamehole this year? You said
yes, that's the plan.
That is the plan. Is it easier to get tickets for that?
Yes, it is.
I mean, is it really the same whole experience? So basically, you're cloning exactly what you're doing
here
for Gamehole?
I think it will be very close.
Okay.
There's always some logistical considerations in terms of size of the space and what amenities they have available. So there may be some things that we can't do there at the smaller conventions that we can do here at Gen Con, just because we have the space. But it'll certainly look and feel very much like what you experienced.
All right. I'll have to talk to Alex, because I'm doing a panel for Alex there at Gamehole this year, so I'm definitely going to get tickets.
Yep.
That, yes. Now, what are you up to this time, David?
So I've been kind of shifting around a game called The Drift, which is a lighthearted game about death, and facing death. I've run it at Gen Con a couple times. So I teach role play and run a lot of tabletop games here. Try and bring some of that knowledge back to RIT, where I try and teach new game designers in both digital and non-digital forms how to integrate characters together, how to build stories that really give players agency, how to create something that is not entirely played out in backstory. All these things are really crucial differences with normal media, right? They're you have to really work on how to bring everything on stage. True Dungeon, if everything interesting were to have happened in backstory, then you'd just be kind of walking through, visiting a zoo, seeing what's already there, right? There would be no point.
Yep.
So it's the same thing in any kind of interactive game. Similar, on another kind of more psychological bent, one of the things I'm really interested in is culture, right? And culture of games. And I think one of the things that really makes it valuable for people to do this at every level is the shared experience, the sense that, why do people join social clubs anywhere? Like, we have a real need to do stuff in Boy Scouts, do stuff in church groups, do stuff in, whatever it is.
The Lions Club, the Rotary,
right,
yeah.
Exactly, right. Whatever it is that draws us, there are shared experiences that might be really difficult to do at the time, but after the fact are incredibly meaningful. And they tie the group together.
Yep.
And man, running these games is hard. I mean, I won't lie to you, right? There are easier ways to get in. There are easier barriers of entry. But the really elaborate ones, and the really elaborate costuming, the really elaborate, True Dungeon is hard to put together, right? These are the Camarilla games that are high quality. It's hard to manage this group of people and to put together a solid story for them, right? This is a hard thing to master, but it is completely worthwhile. And people build up to it over time because the shared experiences are self-rewarding, I think. And that phenomena itself is really fascinating to study, right? Really fascinating to look at. What it is that continues to make people want to come back, try harder, push themselves and get involved in more interesting areas, push themselves in what kind of stories can be told, push themselves in what kind of new areas can they explore, make a game about that is entirely done in dance, right? Make a game that is entirely done, there's a game called Sign that is entirely, also no speaking, coincidentally, but it's about a historical riff. There's a time in Nicaragua when there was no sign language in Nicaragua. So they brought together a bunch of kids who were deaf to teach them how to lip read. And they didn't learn how to lip read. What they did was they created a sign language. So this game is about creating meaningful gestures. I won't say a sign language because that's, that they admit it's not creating a sign language, but it's the beginning of it. Creating meaningful gestures together that allows you to start communicating more and more advanced concepts, even within a 4-hour period, 2-hour period, right? You go from, this is my name, to, I have three siblings, I miss them a great deal, I really want to make sure that they go to good schools, and I really would like to be an astronaut, but I don't think I can. Right? And with simple gestures, you can actually get there, right? And that's pretty cool. It's not historical, it's riffing off the history, but that experience has been really powerful for those of us who played it. And the people putting it together have created an experience that is meaningful to other people. That's good stuff, right?
And so, Anne, I heard that the costume contest went over yesterday because people were late for the dinner that I was going to, who were stuck behind massive crowds that had congested things from the costume contest. How much has this grown? How big is this now at Gen Con?
Oh, it's pretty big, and I try not to think about it because I freak myself out. When I first took it over in 1997, so we were in the Plankinton Theater in the old Mecca building in Milwaukee. Beautiful old nifty theater with a backstage and rooms, and it was great. And we probably had 35, 40 people, and there was some entertainment. If anyone remembers the great Lukski, he was our entertainment at sort of a halftime and a while the ballots are being tallied, to fluff out the show. By the time we left Milwaukee, we were probably up to about 50 to 60 costumes, and the room was packed. 850 seats were filled, and there were people standing around the edges, and we blew fire code, I'm sure. And I have no idea why it got so big. But came here in the same thing. It was standing room only, and we started to fill up more contestants. About 4 or 5 years ago, I would say, for the first time, we ended up having to turn away costumers because there were just too many. So we say we'll take 70. In my head, I think 75, and this year I pushed it up a little bit because there were some costumes I just didn't want to have wander off. We had 81. And we did run a little bit long. I had a new MC this year who did a great job, but his pacing was just a little bit different. And we had a few little, you wouldn't even notice, kind of hiccups. But so yeah, it's gotten really big. So we're over capacity on contestants. We're over capacity on the room. It's the biggest room they can give us, which is okay. And they've gotten the standing room kind of thing sorted out. And it just keeps getting bigger, and I'm not sure why. Although cosplay has become a thing in general, it's become bigger nationwide. You have Heroes of Cosplay, you have other costume contests that are huge, high stakes, big prizes, big money. But one of the things I love about this costume contest is we have a lot of first timers, and I've never done this before, but I just want to do this costume. And they come and they have a great time, and they're encouraged, and they feel like they want to go off and make their next costume. And I have people every year say, oh, next year we're going to do this. They're already thinking for next year. So why it's grown like that, I honestly can't say, but it's definitely taken off and exploded, and I think it's really, really neat. I'd love to know how gaming, I can speak to my own experience. I'd love to know how gaming and costuming applies to people's real life skills. Having worked at TSR, in fact, one of our Facebook groups one day, he put up, give me a word you learned because you played D&D. And people put up carapace and greaves and like the names of armor and weapons and all these crazy things, and the list just kept going on and on and on. It was really neat. And when I would interview for a job or started, talk to someone about freelance work, well, what is it about game editing? You're looking in so many directions at the same thing, and like you're saying,
right.
You're trying to design a game for different people and different characters, and you've got to look at things from so many different angles. There's so much problem solving. And I wish you could put this on your resume, right? That I was a gamer, and this is what I got out of it, and this is why I'm gonna be your next great marketing person, or your next great engineer, or there's so much problem solving, creativity, experimentation, trial and error involved in all of this, and I think that's a really important aspect of it. We get a lot out of gaming that I don't think we even realize, and same with costuming. We figure things out.
It is a shame you can't take credit for it, and that
Yeah.
it isn't recognized in our mundane life as a beneficial side effect from doing something that we're passionate about. I mean, you were talking about motivations of why people do this. I mean, my kids even have discovered that this is something that's okay to do. And literally it was, I can do this? And you're like, yeah, you can do this. Do it. And it doesn't matter that it's not the best. If you feel comfortable, if you're happy in it, who cares? I can't judge that. That's not for me to tell you, you shouldn't be wearing this costume because it's not historically accurate.
Right.
Or it's not perfect, or you didn't, that seems crooked. That's for those people who care about those things. It's
Right.
What does it make you feel like?
Well, and I think, the message here should be, if there's something you're interested in, just try it.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to produce the best costume ever. If it's your first attempt, do the best you can and figure things out. And if you're going to design a game or write a book or, try a new job or go off to college, I mean, it's all the same thing. Just give it a try. If it doesn't quite work out, so what? But it could be your next great thing. And I think this is an environment that lets people experiment a little bit with, well, I'll try that game, and I'll try this, and maybe I'll build a costume, and maybe I'll try to, there's so many ways to try things that are new. And I think, the other thing I'm seeing is, are you kind of familiar with the whole gamification concept? We're just starting to see gaming get some validity in the business world, because gamification is the philosophy that you can apply gaming concepts to a real life situation. And the best example are Starbucks and grocery stores and all these places that have a rewards program.
Yes.
Because you scan your card
Absolutely.
and you accumulate points and you get a reward. And the more you do that, you become more loyal and you get your reward out of it, and the company gets your business. And this is becoming, there's a lot more attention being paid to this. And if I remember right, is it Amazon? It's one of the companies in California. They make all their employees play Settlers of Catan, at least once, because it's a different way of problem solving and analyzing things, and it's a set of skills that I don't think you can get anywhere else. So it's really exciting to see the gaming industry suddenly just on the edge of getting validation in the business world.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting in the future when you can put like game master, dungeon master, storyteller on a resume, and someone will know what that means, because those words don't do justice to all the work that all of those people do to write, design, set up, execute.
That me as an interviewer can look at that and say, okay, that's a creative person. That's the person I want to hire because they have the ability to think far outside the box, and it might even be a what box type of a situation.
And one particular skill that I think you get out of this industry that it's really hard to put a good name on it is when you can look at a project and in your head you are analyzing how can this be broken. And one of the things about editing game rules was, how will the players figure out a way to either not play it true to the plot or break a rule and do something like, no, that's not how that spell is supposed to work. So you've got this eye on how will this not work when we put it out there. I mean, I've seen a lot of surveys go out that somebody created a survey and they put it out there, but there's all kinds of mistakes and you can't get from A to B, or you would dead end, and they haven't thought it through. And that's kind of a simple example, but I think you get what I mean. Is when you can analyze things, even like with costumes too. Well, but if I make this pencil skirt, I'm not down to my ankles, I'm not going to be able to walk when I get on stage. You have to look at how can this be broken, and how do I prevent that, and how am I looking ahead to prevent those kinds of things.
Yeah,
I wish there was a name for that skill. And I that we could talk about
Risk assessment?
Maybe. So.
Yeah.
But don't you feel like that's something you see and you feel and you?
Well, that's when I mentor new storytellers for LARPs. That's one of the first things. That's one of the first rules I always tell them, is that plot never survives contact with the players. I don't care how well you laid it out, how many contingencies you've come up with. somebody's going to break it. So just be ready to make something else up mid-game, because your soap opera script is not what's going to happen. You're going to end up with something completely different.
Yeah.
So, and it's usually more fun that way anyway.
Yeah, along the same lines, True Dungeon always feels like we are maybe a half a step ahead of the players in terms of attempting to game the system, attempting to break the system, especially with the tokens, which creates, every time we introduce a new token, we change the rules. And so it's how us being extremely careful about how we word how that token is supposed to be used, and then the subsequent impact that that has downstream. We could be talking about creating one little piece of plastic that could potentially completely change our game moving forward, so that 3 or 4 years down the road, it's played in a completely different way than we started.
Well, and you see, even in Pokemon Go, I know there's some rules that they've had to like pull back on because you know the Blissey, is it the one that's like way super too powerful, and they've had to like pull it down. But even in that environment, you see mistakes being made, and once you put it out there, people figured out to ways to kind of abuse it, and okay, this isn't what we wanted. So
World of
that's, you
Warcraft
bring
is a
up a good
constant.
thing about the future of LARPing there. So how much do we think AR kinds of things like that will affect what we do here? And are any of you looking at AR-based games or mobile games like that as tools to help us do our LARPs? Why doesn't True Dungeon do its tokens on your iPhone at this point? And
We've talked about it, and I think that part of, we've even talked about some of the physical things that are very much a part of True Dungeon standard. So the canon of True Dungeon, the thieves have a puzzle box that they have to work through. And we talked about changing it and turning it into an iPad. And the reaction from our fans was, no, don't do this. And so I think that there's a role for AR in the terms of making the special effects easier for us to do, so that the experience is more immersive. But I think we have to be very careful so that we're not taking away from the social, interactive gaming experience that we achieve through all of these variations of interactive gameplay.
have you looked at all? I had an opportunity a couple years ago to see what Tracy Hickman is working on now for The Void, the Visions of Infinite Dimensions, which is a VR thing where you put on, an Oculus Rift, but you're going through a physical maze, and they just overlay. You're on a space station, you have a gun, you're shooting things, but any wall you see you can touch. And then you'll find an elevator that'll take you to a different level, like it'll rumble, but you're then still, could you see True Dungeon being that in 20 years? Or do you think the physicality of these things is crucial to the experience for players?
I think that if that would happen, I think it would be a split. So I think True Dungeon won't become 2 games, because I think there's still a desire to have that physicality piece. If something like that were to succeed, it might be a spin-off. I remember reading a book when I was a teenager. Larry Niven and Steve Barnes wrote Dream Park.
Yeah.
And I have always seen True Dungeon as the boy. If we could just take that and make True Dungeon World, where we've got an anchor for essentially True Dungeon World hosts. Don't want to be. I'm sorry if I'm being terribly sacrilegious here, but True Dungeon World hosts Gen Con. So you have an anchor place where other cons could come, set up their environments, and do their thing, but the tech was there to enable them to do it easier, better, and to allow the players to have that experience.
One of the earliest American kind of physical LARPing groups was the International Fantasy Gaming Society, which took their name from Dream Park, right? So everyone loved Dream Park.
Yep.
What do you think? Should I have my character sheets for like Vampire LARPs on my iPhone? Do you now? Or?
Yeah, all kinds of people bring digital sheets, and with so where we using.
Should we resolve our challenges right with the phone?
A friend of mine coded a rock paper scissors app a few years ago for one of our bigger conventions, and you always knew when somebody was using it because he put a hell of a bell sound in it. White Wolf and By Night Studios are teaming up beta.worldofdarkness.com. It's a chronicle management system, and it's online. And one of the things it supports is, I don't remember off the top of my head if it's RFID or Bluetooth beacons, but if you are logged into the website on your mobile device and you get near the beacon pushes information to your phone, and it can be anything from there's a book here and it says blah, 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 to you just ran into a pack of werewolves. Good luck. So, the technology has so many really cool applications because, like, I think all LARPs struggle with, gaming period, you struggle to get volunteers. You struggle to get people who are going to give up their game time to run the game, to write the game, to narrate at the game, to help to play NPCs.
Thank God we have Dave. Yes.
And technology like that allows the storyteller to set up and deploy these beacons, tell people to get on the website. When they get near something, their characters have an encounter, and it requires minimal management from the game staff in order to get those people into the game doing something and having fun.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, so I think there would be, when you ask about that, that's a really good example of where tech and VR might enhance True Dungeon, in that it just allows us to have those people step into the world faster.
I can tell you, if anyone comes with a virtual costume to the costume contest, I won't be entering them. And I agree. There's a lot of things you can do character sheet wise, rulebook wise on a device that makes a ton of sense. You can search for things, you can find things, you can carry them. They're portable. However, I'm kind of saddened by the fact that, having gone to those Star Wars conventions years ago, one of the main attractions was the archives. And there were the movie costumes and the movie props and the speeder that Luke drove around, and all these and the actual Yoda that Frank Oz operated. And it was so neat to stand there and look at this actual movie stuff. And because of all the CG nowadays, hardly any of that exists, which is kind of a pity that you can't actually go see it and take your picture next to it. That stuff doesn't actually exist. And I think for True Dungeon, likewise, I think people love the experience of seeing it, feeling it. It's there, it's real. They've had a few displays at Gen Con in past years of giant creatures or just a photo op kind of thing, and people really love that.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have one of the True Dungeon giants in the museum.
Yes,
Lucas
yes.
Oil Field
Yep.
right now. If you haven't been, you have a few more hours. We're tearing it down at 4.
So there's that window of what is too much tech and what isn't enough, what's not enough tech, and where is tech enabling and making something smoother as opposed to like minimizing the experience.
Right.
Yeah.
David, any thoughts?
Sure, two shout outs to things that I'm not involved in, so they're not mine to shout out to. But Planet Follow down in Texas is using a fully AR smartphone driven mechanic system for all sorts of things in a science fiction setting. So you actually have a device that you're scanning everything with, in setting and out of setting. So it's a nice diegetic kind of experience. I haven't played it myself, but that's really what they're going for. And one of the things that in VR, I think we're struggling with, I don't think VR's there yet, but one of the experiments that I think has really worked well is a game, I'm going to get the name somewhat wrong, but Keep Talking or You'll Die?
Yes.
Something like that?
Yeah,
Keep Talking,
yes,
I got it.
right.
Yeah, somebody, right.
Yeah.
Keep talking or somebody explodes. And that is a totally social VR experience where one person has goggles on and is seeing one thing and they have to explain it to everyone else and they have to interact on it. And that kind of thing really keeps the social dynamic that I am excited about, keeps the VR experience to be limited to what they can do right now, and works really well. So I think people are beginning to figure out ways to use AR and VR really effectively. I like the idea in AR of having a set physical space that you can control and then supplementing it. I mean, that's what it's for.
Overlaying on it.
Yeah.
Which Magic Leap is doing down in Florida.
Yeah.
So-
And then popping out maybe 1,000 feet. I've always been worried that in YouTube, with the expansion of YouTube and everything like that people are going to start comparing themselves negatively to everything that they can see, because the best things in the world are always available to them, right? They're not going to be, I was afraid that they're not necessarily going to be striving to make good games because they're seeing good games played on YouTube all the time and they know they can't do that. So they're just going to watch YouTube, which would make them completely passive in this thing that is beautiful because it is so thoroughly interactive. I don't think I'm seeing that.
Yeah.
Right. I think that people are instead being inspired to try and bring pieces of it to them, to their games, inspired by YouTube explanations about how to put costumes together, and that skills them up, right? That gives them the ability to skill up a little bit. I think that those of us in my generation, getting older, we're always kind of comparing ourselves and feeling a little inferior. And the new people that grew up with this availability, the younger people who grew up with this availability of reaching out to YouTube and finding an answer or finding ideas, are just seeing it as more places to learn. So I'm really positively inspired by that. I'm excited by that this
right.
thing doesn't seem to be happening that I was afraid of.
Yeah, we just had Matt Mercer
No,
here
please.
Matt Mercer here the other day, and he was phenomenal. The Critical Role.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
How many
yeah,
kids in
absolutely.
the audience said, "I play my game because of you," right? For Fit That D&D. So we are at time, but we could probably do a question if there is a question out there from anyone. We are at time, so I mean, we can always
Thank you all.
Please, thanks for
If-
coming.
Parting
Thank you.
thoughts,
Morning.
parting thoughts, if you're interested in it, try it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Be
for
safe
sure.
about it and
Yeah.
ask for help, ask for experts, so.
And if you're interested in putting something together, try it. You want to make a True Dungeon at home? Try it.
Do it, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Nothing stopping you.
That's right.
Give me something to play.
Yep.
Thank you to our
Right.
panelists. Thank you.